everyone. Hope everybody is doing well. I wanted to talk about a subject where I think a lot of people are essentially overreacting and scapegoating for a lot of the problems we have in our society, particularly in the English speaking world. And I look a lot of comments everywhere, or people tell me that a lot of problems we have is simply because of smartphones, the apps, so-called social media, electronics, and they like to blame so many things on those aspects, but yet they fail to realize that other aspects play a role as well. And one of the reasons why I think this whole idea that phone apps are just somehow just the wrong scapegoat is just not true, because they ignore other aspects, but not to mention they don't really see how these problems don't really exist in various parts of the world. So for an example, they blame electronics on why, for an example, malls are declining, the way that children and neighbors aren't even getting together, okay? But they fail to understand that it's not necessarily that the device itself is designed to keep people alienated. Maybe it's the fear-mongering, the messaging that's coming out of these electronics that's making people fearful or change their behaviors one way or another. So let's talk about, for an example, malls, okay? There's a lot of different reasons why malls, especially indoor shopping malls, have been declining. But obviously they want to blame Amazon, e-commerce, all these other avenues, like at least 80% of the problem, which from my experience, I think it's probably only 30% of the problem. They ignore private equity, rental rates, customer service, the crowds that go there, the friendliness, the car dependency, the decline in the economy. They ignore all these other aspects of why the mall has declined, and they just simply want to blame e-commerce. And I think the problem with that is that it kind of just ignores other aspects that may play a role. Now, one of the reasons why I'm not really believing in this e-commerce talking point is that other countries around the world, developed or not, whether you go to parts of Europe, if you go to Mexico, whether you go to the Philippines, which I've been there, malls are thriving. They have a very high occupancy rate, despite many of the same technologies. One of the things I noticed when you walk into a mall in the Philippines, they actually check your bags and stuff. So I think people don't go to these places because we've had for many years all these mass shootings, and it makes people want to just stay at home. That could be it. Nevertheless, the other thing is that people are realizing it's just not very pleasant having to drive, spend a long time finding for parking just to walk into some ugly box just to get some things. Other cities around the world, they're more pedestrian friendly. People can take transit to get there. And this is why even when you look at major shopping centers that are built differently in some of the inner cities, depending on how they approach crime and how they've changed from COVID in terms of it's a long story, but they're obviously responding differently. Their results are totally different. But we always like to just scapegoat e-commerce. We like, when it comes to Sears, for an example, we know what happened. The new CEO took over in the mid-2000s. He ran the company into the ground. And that not only affected the stores, but all the stores that were connected to these shopping malls. Now, remember, Sears is still a place where, nevertheless, is existing in Mexico. Another useless scapegoat that we seem to think that, by the way, is blaming for these phone apps and electronics is the social life, the dating scene. And when you go to overseas countries, those dynamics are totally different, okay? But we seem to want to blame smartphones for all the problems we have, oh yeah, of course it did have some effect. But the reality is what we fail to ignore, that part of the reason why the social life went downhill is that, which has been kind of going downhill since the 1980s, is because one thing I've been told is that because of these abduction scares that happened in the 1980s, people are more fearful than they were talking to strangers. One of the things I've noticed is that workplace climate has gone downhill because one of the things people just push all this nasty corporate culture, drama. One of the things is that young people, in the English-speaking world especially, they model themselves too much to these trends and social habits that's being pushed by celebrities, which, the celebrities have different impacts all over the world. And so that affects dating. We have a poor social networking. Personally, one of the things I've noticed is that young people just don't go out as much as they used to, so you can blame the economy. There's a lot of other factors. So I think high electronic use is really the symptom of the problem. It's not so much the problem itself. And of course, if you look at dating, if you look at the agendas that's being pushed by particular media outlets, not necessarily the electronics itself, because things were worsening before the smartphone. I can show you a lot of charts and data to show that things were going downhill before 2007. And by the way, the smartphone didn't really take effect in mainstream culture until around 2015. When a product comes out, it doesn't dominate several years later. Okay, the internet came in 1991, but it didn't really dominate until the late 90s and early 2000s. Keep that in mind. When you think about it, the messages that were being pushed by celebrities, academia, it was making the scene going downhill since many argue the 1980s or the 1990s. Okay, so it's not necessarily electronics itself, it's the messaging that really comes with it. And this is why when men go to date, not just in countries like the Philippines or in Latin America, but even certain European countries, they see a much different outcome because their lifestyle is different. The population is generally younger. What they like is different. So like some countries, they're not so much into the drama and chaos that comes from toxic men. When you talk to other young men, as a young man, they're more likely to engage with you and have a conversation. Here it's just so much about being cool and following the fashion trends and everything, just dressing in a certain way, talking a certain way. So the reality is, it's really the legacy elite corporate media that has really disproportionately affected the English-speaking world, perhaps more than anything else. And not to mention how our cities are built. We are very car dependent. We're in cul-de-sacs, gated neighborhoods. We have these strip malls where we shop and hang out, which is not very human scale. You have to look at the low trust society. Maybe multiculturalism has a role, the increase in homelessness, just the lack of class and being a quality person. There's all these other factors, but yet we just want to keep blaming electronics, like video games, why children aren't playing outside anymore. But yet you go to other countries around the world, neighbors are more likely to get together. And we saw these trends worsening before the smartphone was really coming along. Because I remember neighbors were getting together less often in the 2000s than they were in the 1990s. And the 1990s was less than the 1980s. So it's just insane how electronics is constantly being scapegoated. But in reality, it's the fear-mongering, it's the reality that many of these policymakers have created that affects the well-being of ordinary Americans. I mean, you have to keep in mind that health, the addictions that we have, all of that plays a significant role. Keep that in mind. And then when you go to overseas, coworkers are more likely to get together. Getting around is totally different. There's more pedestrians out in the streets. So in short and summary, it's almost like people think that 2010, social life, dating, dynamics of everything was so much better, almost as if, well, if the smartphone was never created, magically everything would be so much better. But they ignore other factors, the agenda that was pushed by the television, legacy corporate media, the economic factors, all these different dynamics, which kind of makes me want to bring up this film, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. The actor Martin played that film in 1988, and he had a frustrating time getting from his corporate meeting in New York City back to Chicago, where his flights changed, the trains have problem, rental cars, hitchhiking, all that other stuff he had to go through, which makes you think, like, people will say, oh, so much things were better in 1988. But the reality is that, yes, some things have worsened since the 80s in terms of, you can say, our economic buying power, our social dynamics in some aspects. But the reality is, if you had the internet, if you had the smartphone, if you could text one another, if you can book a rental car on your phone, if you can get updates from whichever private server, whoever, things would have been a lot more convenient. Then the thing makes you want to ask, if we had, then just think about it, folks. Like, is really electronics are the heart of our problems, or is just really a scapegoat?